So as you've guessed, we're talking about Moses today. We're also going to talk about Moses next week with the 10 Commandments, but this week we're diving into the Exodus a little bit and the lead up to the Exodus and the plagues. And so there's so many parts to this story, so much we can do. So let's try to dig into it, and I'll try not to get too all over the place. So I don't know how many others have seen the movie The 10 Commandments with Charlton Heston. It was a movie, yes, I see a few hands. It was a movie that I think was on TV like every day when I was a child. I have a memory that every single time I was sick at home, I would end up watching this movie. And I will confess, I'm actually not feeling super great this morning. And I was like, I don't know if that's a psychosomatic thing because I'm talking about Moses and I just associate it with being sick. But in any case, yes, it's an amazing movie. So some of you were at the Bible study earlier this week, but many were not. So let's back up a little bit and talk about the things leading up to this first plague. This was the first plague here, and there are 10 of them, so we have a lot to cover. But first, the Israelites had been in Canaan, and then there's a famine, so they go down to Egypt, which has the Nile and a very fertile land, so there's food there. And they go, and after many generations, they get enslaved. And Pharaoh and the people in power start to be concerned about the power that the Israelites have because there are so many of them. Tell me if there are parts of this story that start to sound like political talking points today, because you're going to notice that many of them. So Pharaoh says, there are too many, they're getting too strong, we have to do something. So he enslaves them. And so finally he says, well, they're having too many babies. So he orders the midwives to kill all the baby boys as they're born. But the two midwives, so one of the nice things in this story is Moses is the central character, but there are lots of people that don't listen to Pharaoh. And I'm going to highlight them as we go. So the two midwives, the Egyptian midwives, Sipra and Pua, they don't listen to Pharaoh's orders because they want to protect the babies and the women. So they keep letting the baby boys get born. So then he says, okay, this isn't working. So now we have to throw the baby boys in the Nile. And so Moses' mother, Jochebed, gives birth to him and hides Moses for 3 months. And then she says, okay, I know that it's not safe for him to be here. So she and his sister Miriam put him in a basket. You'll remember this from the movie, if you saw this famous scene in the movie. And he goes down the Nile. And Pharaoh's daughter sees this baby boy and also doesn't want to kill him. So now we have many people, all women, incidentally, who are not listening to Pharaoh. And she says, okay, no, I'm not going to kill this baby. I'm going to adopt him as my own. And so Miriam comes and says, well, here, I can help you. I can find a wet nurse from among the Israelites. So she goes back to her mother. And so Pharaoh's daughter basically conspires with Moses' sister to let Moses be raised by his mother. So he's protected. But then eventually when he's grown up, he gets adopted into the family and is somewhat half Egyptian in this way, adopted. But he has a strong moral center, which is one of his best qualities. And so one day he's out in the city and he sees an Egyptian beating a slave, an Israelite slave, and he won't have that. And he fights back and he kills the Egyptian and then realizes this was maybe not a good idea for him. So he buries the body in the sand and he goes on his way and thinks, okay, maybe I'll be all right. But the next day he sees two Israelites fighting each other and he also doesn't want that to stand. So he goes to break it up. And they say, we know what you did. We know you killed an Egyptian yesterday. Are you going to kill us? So he gets concerned. And he says, okay, people know what I did. So he becomes a fugitive. So he runs and hides in the wilderness. And when he's in the wilderness, he goes to the well. And he sees that Jethro has 7 daughters. And the daughters are drawing from the well. And some other shepherds come up, some male shepherds, and they're harassing the daughters. So he stands up for them. So this is his third act of justice. And he protects the daughters. And so Jethro is so grateful that he says, okay, you can marry one of my daughters. And he ends up marrying Zipporah and then having a family and living in the wilderness. And then one day he's out at Mount Horeb and the exact thing that Tama was telling us about happens with the burning bush. So he has this mystical divine experience and God appears to him. And God says, and there's many curious parts of what God says, but God says, I remember now my covenant with Abraham. And Abraham's people are, living as slaves in Egypt. And I need to get them out. And you're going to be the person who's going to help me. So God isn't looking so great in this part of the story already. Because it's as though he forgot about this covenant for the 500 years that the Israelites have been here enslaved. But he remembers now. So I guess there's that. So Moses gives 5 reasons why Moses shouldn't be the one to help God. So first Moses says that he doesn't think he's good enough. Moses says, "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the children of Israel out of Egypt?" So remember, he's a fugitive, and he himself is kind of half Israelite, half Egyptian. And he's been living as a shepherd. He doesn't feel like he's the right person. And God doesn't want to hear it. And so then he says, well, I don't know enough. He says, when I come to the children of Israel and say, the God of your fathers has sent me to you, they're going to say, what's the name of this God? Because the Egyptian gods have lots of names. So what's your name? And that's where the name Yahweh is first said. And then Moses says, but the people aren't going to believe me anyway, even with this name. So Moses tells God, suppose they don't believe me and they don't listen to my voice. They're going to say the Lord has not appeared to you. And God says, no, still, you need to go. And then most famously, he says, but I'm a terrible speaker. He says, I'm not eloquent, neither before nor since you've spoken to me. I'm slow of speech and slow of tongue. And in the Midrash, it said he probably stutters. It's either that he's not fluent in Egyptian, so he has a hard time conveying his thoughts in that language, and or he stutters. And God says, don't worry, I'll send you help. Your brother Aaron's going to help. And then he says, even after all that, I'm not qualified. My Lord, please send by the hand of whomever else you may send. And Moses is kind of whiny. It's funny, later on in the story, he's thought of as very strong leader. But in this point, he's quite whiny, and he gives up very easily. And so I don't know if that resonates with any of us, where he felt like, I don't know. On one hand, I feel called, but I'm not really good at this. I don't know what I'm doing. I don't think I'm the right person. Surely there's someone stronger and better than me who could do this. But God is like, no, I promise you're the right person. And God sends all these other people to help Moses. So earlier we have the Egyptian midwives who are doing God's will and are not killing the babies. We have Moses' mother and sister. We have Pharaoh's daughter. And then God says, look, I'm going to send help with you. It's okay. It's not just you. So he gets his older brother Aaron, who's going to help, who also wasn't killed because that was before the decree. He teams up with Miriam, and Miriam's the one who's able to get the water out of the rocks, who's integral to their survival later in the desert. Also later on, he gets Hur, who is one of the generals who counsels him when they're battling the Egyptians in the desert. And then he gets his assistant, Joshua. So on one hand, it's the story of Moses, but it's also the story of many, many people who rise to the occasion during this in order to free the Israelites. So it's not just one person, but it's a whole team who are all doing God's will, even if they don't feel like they're qualified. So all of this leads up to the passage that Broadus just read this morning. And so God says, okay, I know that Pharaoh's heart will be hardened, but I'm going to send these plagues down on Egypt. And so this is the first plague. So if you've forgotten this part of the story, here are the 10 plagues. So this is the first one, is the Nile turns the blood. The second one is God sends frogs. And I really enjoyed the kid who was hopping along earlier, and I was like, oh, this is perfect. We have a frog here with us already. So there are many, many frogs is the second plague. Then we get lice is the third, then flies. Then there's a pestilence among the livestock. And then boils, hail, locusts, darkness, and finally the death of the firstborn. And so there are these 10 plagues. And either at the beginning or the end, or sometimes both, it's said that Pharaoh's heart is hardened, and Pharaoh remains steadfast and will not let the people go. And so first I want to talk just about the plagues. So there's a lot of imagery, lots and lots of stories about these. They're really evocative. There are lots of different interpretations of the plagues. So you could just study these alone, and it's really interesting. But I found 3 interpretations for the plagues that I like. So the first one is that each one is actually showing God's power over an element that would normally, the Egyptians would understand to be controlled by an Egyptian god. So the first one, the Nile turning to blood, could show that God is more powerful than Khnum or Hapi and Osiris, who are the guardian spirit and blood of the river Nile in Egyptian mythology. The frogs are showing God's power over Hapi and Heket, the Egyptian fertility goddesses, whose symbol is the frog. The third is lice, showing God's power over Seb, the god of the earth, and of all small creatures. The flies is about Uchat, the god of the flies. The Egyptians actually had a god of the flies. The livestock pestilence is showing God's power over Hathor and Ammon, the gods of cows and bulls. The boils are God's power over Imhotep, the god of healing. Hail is Nut, the goddess of the sky. Locust is Serapia, the god that protects Egypt from locusts, and actually which has a locust face. And I don't want to live in a place where I need a god to protect me from locusts. Oh no, I'm a little worried that locusts are that prevalent here. Ra, the sun god, who's so important, but God causes darkness. And finally, the death of the firstborn is God's power over Pharaoh himself, because his heir was killed. So suddenly he doesn't have anyone to go after him. His very son is killed, and it ends the line of Pharaoh. So that's one interpretation, is these are the Egyptian gods, and showing that the God of Moses is stronger than them. Another interpretation is this is actually undoing the creation story. And I find this really interesting. So the waters that God is on, the waters turn to blood to signify the blood that the Egyptians have caused by enslaving the Israelites. The water, land, and air animals are now being weaponized against the people. So rather than them being created and then serving the people or being, in relationship with the people, they're being weaponized to attack the people. The people's skin or dust being turned against them with the boils. The sky, remember it's separated, the water and the sky is falling down now because of hail. The light is being turned off, and it's going back into darkness. And then the death of humankind. So it's actually undoing the whole creation story in this, which is very dramatic. And finally, a lot has been written about understanding these as natural disasters. And I think this really appeals to a lot of folks now, as we have many, many natural disasters. And around this time, both before and slightly after when we expect that this had happened, there were big volcanic eruptions. First in Santorini in 1620 BCE, which is about 400 years before Ramses II, who's thought to be the pharaoh talked about here. And then also several years later, there was a big volcanic eruption in Iceland. And when these happened, the sky turned black. There were algae plumes in the water, or something called a red tide that would turn the water red. There would be lots of insects coming because of the red tide, and lots of frogs. And as they're dying, the people would get sick, and the animals would get sick, and the kids would die. So actually referring to natural disasters that were happening both before when we figure this happened, and then before the time of Jesus. So these kind of plagues would be something that people would understand what that period of time was like, because they know in history we've gone through periods of time like that. So these are different ways of understanding the specific plagues. But I want to turn now to the idea that God is hardening Pharaoh's heart. I have a memory when I was in college, I studied philosophy. And my second year, we were reading the Bible. And I went to St. John's College, where the classes are all discussion-based. And I have a really funny memory of reading the story of Exodus. And that night, we're reading it, and we have class, and there's a storm going on outside. And this is a true story. It sounds very dramatic, but it's a true story. And one of the students says, well, can't we just say that this is God's fault? Because God is sending all these plagues, but God says that God's hardening Pharaoh's heart. So isn't this really God's fault? And right around the time the student asked this, there's like big claps of thunder outside. And the student right away is like, but I love God. And it is so hilarious. But it's kind of true, right? Because the way it's set up, God isn't looking very good. So God's saying, oh, by the way, I forgot. Your people have been living in slavery for 500 years, but I'm going to harden Pharaoh's heart. And then it's true in the story. It said that Pharaoh's heart is hardened about 20 times. And it often says it at the start and then the end, or the start or the end of each of the plagues. So what's going on with this? And a lot has been written about this. But what I think is really interesting, and sometimes it's said that Pharaoh hardens his own heart, and sometimes God hardens Pharaoh's heart, but they're used a little bit interchangeably. But if you look at the Hebrew, there are actually 3 different words that are used for harden. And so the one is chazek, which is actually to strengthen. One is kasha, which is to harden. And one is kabed, which is to make heavy. And each time they're usually translated as harden. And this part I'm getting from Rabbi Jonathan Sachs. He writes about this and the difference between those things. So to strengthen, to harden, or to make heavy. And he says, well, when something is strengthened, so like at the start of this, it said that Pharaoh's heart was strengthened. God is showing that Pharaoh has free will. So in this context, your heart is really, you have a choice what you're going to do. So God is strengthening Pharaoh's heart so Pharaoh can make what he knows to be the best decision. And then, of course, he makes the worst decision. Unless these things continue to happen. And sometimes Pharaoh says he hardens his heart. But when that one is used, it's Pharaoh doing it himself. But then the one that's the most interesting is to make heavy. So at that time, in Egyptian mythology, I don't know if you've ever seen some of the hieroglyphics with this, but when someone dies, their heart is weighed against a feather. And so they get questioned by the gods of the underworld, whether or not they get to enter the underworld. And their heart is put on a scale up against a feather. And they're asked 42 questions. And they have to say, I have not done injury to men. I have not oppressed those beneath me. I have not murdered. I have not commanded murder. I've not caused suffering to anyone. And these kind of questions. And if your heart is heavy, and heavier than the feather, because you are actually doing these things against people, then you're not going to get into the afterlife. And so when God says, I made Pharaoh's heart heavy, the interpretation is that that's actually showing that even though God is not the God of the Egyptians at this time and does not need the Egyptians to follow the rules of the Israelites, morality is universal. So even within the Egyptian morality system, Pharaoh is sinning, is doing the wrong thing. And so his heart is heavy. It's too heavy because he's not doing what he's supposed to do. And so it takes him doing all of these. And you see even in this story, the people, the Egyptians, suddenly they have no water. They have to go digging. But Pharaoh doesn't care. He goes inside and he strengthens his own heart. He feels good about the decision he made. And so the people suffer throughout this. But it's Pharaoh's fault. But he's still being weighed because of that. And in his own system, he's doing the wrong thing. And so you've maybe heard me say, and I'll just finish with this, that Passover is actually my favorite holiday. A fun thing about being an interfaith minister is you get to celebrate all the holidays. You get to eat all the time. It's great. And Passover is actually my favorite one because it's understood as such a universal story, that you have people who are being oppressed. And then all these dramatic things happen, but then God comes and God frees those who are being oppressed, that God is always with us. And so my favorite part of the Passover story is where it said you have the second cup of wine, which is usually joy. And they say we can't have too much joy right now because of what the Egyptians experienced. So you take your cup of wine, and then with your pinky, you take out 10 drops of wine, one for each of the plagues, because this is what the Egyptians had to experience. And that lessens our joy, because they shouldn't have had to experience this, but it's Pharaoh's fault. And then it said, and today we have so many plagues still. What are the other things that keep us from feeling joy? And people call out things like climate change, and oppression, and racism, and homophobia, and transphobia, and people fighting today. And you say all the current plagues that are still happening, that we've hardened our hearts against. And because of this, our hearts are heavy. And at the end, you have on your plate a bunch of drops of wine that you've taken out of the cup, because this collectively lessens our joy. But you still have the rest of the glass, because you know that God is still with you, and God is always on the side of the oppressed. And somehow, God will let the people go. Thank you for listening. Amen.